You know, life doesn't fall apart in an instant. It unravels bit by bit, like a slow leak in a tire you don't even notice until it's too late. That's how it started between Julia and me. For 5 years, I thought we were fine. Like really fine. We had a routine, sure, but it was comfortable. I work in it, the type of jobs that pays enough to keep the lights on and take a trip every now and then. Julia was different though. She was sharp. A lawyer. She had a way of turning any argument into a win, even if she didn't have the facts on her side. That was one of the things that drew me to her. She could talk circles around me. But that sharpness? It started feeling more like a weapon aimed at me. It was little things at first. A sarcastic comment here. A dismissive look there. She'd correct me in front of others like I didn't know what I was talking about. And yeah, sometimes it was playful. But other times, it stung. I started noticing how it wasn't just me who saw it. Our friends did too. We had this tight-knit group, about 8 of us, who'd hang out all the time. Barbecues, game nights, beach trips. Julia always seemed to have this spark when she talked to Ben though. Ben was the easygoing, fun guy everyone liked. He was charming, always cracking jokes, and could lighten the mood no matter what. But the way Julia laughed at his jokes, the way she looked at him, different from how she looked at me, made my stomach turn. At first, I told myself I was being stupid. They were friends, that's all. And in our circle, everyone was close. But slowly, it became harder to ignore. The texts, the private smiles, the way Julia's phone seemed to buzz every time Ben was around. My gut was screaming at me, but my brain? It was trying to keep the peace. It wasn't until we planned a weekend trip to celebrate our anniversary that things spiraled completely out of control. The trip was supposed to be perfect, our whole group staying at a beachside villa. Sun, sand, and no worries. But from the moment we arrived, I felt it. Julia was distracted, distant. Every time I tried to talk to her about how excited I was for us, she'd give me this tight, fake smile, like I was annoying her. And then there were the texts. Always from Ben. Always with that smirk. The weekend began as it always did, with our group drinks, laughter, and the light-hearted banter that had kept us all close for years. But this time, something was different. Julia was on edge, not her usual charming self. She clung to her phone like it was some lifeline. And when she wasn't on it, she was with Ben. Every time I looked around, I saw them standing too close, whispering too quietly. I started to wonder if anyone else noticed, or if it was just me. Was I being paranoid, or was there something brewing beneath the surface that I hadn't been privy to? That night, as we all sat around the fire pit, watching the waves crash against the shore, I tried to push the unease out of my mind. I needed this weekend to be about Julia and me. About fixing whatever had been silently fraying between us. We had planned this trip to celebrate our anniversary, after all. 5 years of marriage. That had to mean something, didn't it? But even as I tried to pull her attention back, I could see it. Julia was somewhere else. She was sitting next to me, sure. But her mind, her focus, it was entirely on Ben. Every time he cracked a joke, her eyes would light up, and she'd laugh that easy, flirtatious laugh she used to reserve for me. I decided to go for a walk, to clear my head. When I got back, they were gone, both of them. The fire was still burning, but the laughter had shifted. It wasn't the same kind of fun we used to have. It was darker, more private. I asked around. Where had they gone? Most of our friends just shrugged. Some of them, I noticed, wouldn't meet my eyes. I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. This was it, wasn't it? The moment I'd been dreading, but couldn't admit to myself. I headed back to the villa, feeling each step grow heavier. The sound of my shoes crunching on the gravel path was all I could hear, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the porch, I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to open the door. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk away, and never look back. But I did open it. The villa was dimly lit, the soft glow of lamps barely pushing back the darkness. And then I heard it laughter. Not the carefree kind from earlier. This was different. It was coming from upstairs. Julia's laugh, mixed with Ben's deep voice, drifted down the hall. My heart sank, but I moved forward, step by step, until I reached the door to the bedroom we were supposed to be sharing. The door was slightly ajar, and the scene that unfolded in front of me felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Julia was in Ben's arms, her face flushed, her hair tangled, her clothes half on, half off. Ben's shirt was on the floor, his hands were all over her, and they hadn't even bothered to close the door completely. Like they didn't care if someone saw them. Or maybe they just didn't think I would. I didn't say anything. I didn't scream or shout. I just stood there, watching. It felt like an out-of-body experience, like my mind had shut down and I was floating above it all, observing from a distance. Julia didn't notice me at first, but when she did, her face drained of color. "Josh," she gasped, pulling away from Ben, who looked just as shocked to see me. I can't explain. Explain? What could she possibly explain? It was all right in front of me. Her betrayal, their betrayal. There was nothing to explain. I didn't care about their excuses. I didn't care about their apologies. All I wanted to do was leave. But I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot, my mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. Julia scrambled to put her clothes back on, her face twisted with guilt. Ben was silent, standing there like a deer caught in headlights, as if he hadn't expected to get caught in the act. "Josh, please," Julia began again, stepping toward me. "It didn't mean anything. We were just—" I cut her off, my voice cold and distant. "Don't. Just don't." I turned around and walked out of the villa, leaving her standing there with Ben, both of them too stunned to follow me. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from them, from everything. I walked down the beach, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling my ears, drowning out the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm me. I didn't go back that night. I found a small motel down the road, checked in, and collapsed onto the bed. My phone buzzed non-stop texts from Julia, missed calls from friends. I ignored them all. I didn't want to hear what anyone had to say. I didn't want to deal with the reality of what had just happened. The next morning, the harsh light of day didn't make things any better. If anything, it made it worse. The shock had worn off, and now all I felt was anger. Anger at Julia, anger at Ben, anger at myself for not seeing it sooner. How long had this been going on? Had our entire marriage been a lie? I wanted answers, but at the same time, I didn't. What difference would it make? Nothing could undo what I had seen. Nothing could change the fact that my wife had betrayed me in the worst possible way. Eventually, I went back to the villa to collect my things. When I walked in, the air was thick with tension. Julia was there, sitting on the couch, her face puffy from crying. Ben was nowhere to be seen. Good. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to hear his pathetic excuses. Julia stood up as soon as she saw me, her eyes pleading. "Josh, please. Just hear me out." But I didn't want to hear her out. I didn't care what she had to say. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, my voice flat. "It's over." She burst into tears, but I felt nothing. The numbness had taken over again. I grabbed my bag, stuffed my clothes into it, and left without another word. The next few weeks were a blur. I stayed with a friend, barely eating, barely sleeping, just trying to get through each day without thinking about what had happened. But it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together. Every time I tried to distract myself, the memories came flooding back. I couldn't stop thinking about all the little signs I had missed. The late-night texts, the secret smiles, the way Julia had been pulling away from me for months. It was all so obvious now, but I had been too blind, too trusting to see it. My friends tried to be there for me, but I didn't want their pity. I didn't want their advice. I just wanted to be left alone. I needed to figure out what to do next, how to rebuild my life now that everything had fallen apart. One night, as I sat alone in the dark, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Julia. I hadn't responded to any of her messages, but this one was different. It wasn't an apology or a plea for forgiveness. It was a photo of her and Ben, taken months ago at one of our group hangouts. They were sitting next to each other, their faces close, smiling for the camera. And suddenly, It all clicked. This hadn't been a one-time thing. This had been going on for months, maybe even longer. Julia and Ben hadn't just betrayed me, they had been mocking me, right under my nose, pretending to be my friends while they carried on their affair behind my back. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to do something. I couldn't let them get away with it. They needed to face the consequences of their actions. I grabbed my phone, opened the photo, and posted it to our group chat. I added a message. This is who you've been defending. This is who you've been making excuses for. The responses came in almost immediately. Shock, anger, denial. Our friends had known something was off, but none of them had wanted to admit it. They had all been complicit, turning a blind eye to what was happening because it was easier than facing the truth. One by one, they started to turn on Julia and Ben. The group chat exploded with accusations, confrontations, and anger. It was chaos, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. They were finally being held accountable for their actions. Julia called me that night, her voice shaking with anger. "How could you do this?" she demanded. "You're destroying everything." I laughed bitterly. "No, Julia. You destroyed everything. I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth." In the end, it didn't matter. The damage had been done. Our group of friends was shattered, and there was no putting it back together. Some of them chose sides. Others walked away entirely, unable to deal with the fallout. I filed for divorce the next day. It was messy, painful, and drawn out, but it was necessary. Julia fought me on every detail, but in the end, it didn't matter. I was done with her. Done with the lies, the betrayal, the manipulation. I wanted a fresh start, and I was willing to do whatever it took to get it. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. By that time, I had moved out of the city, started a new job, and begun to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy. The pain of what had happened lingered for a long time, but slowly, I started to heal. I cut off all contact with Julia and Ben, as well as most of our old friends. I didn't need the reminders of what had happened. I didn't need the toxic energy in my life. I was better off on my own. It's been a year now since that fateful weekend, and I can finally say that I'm in a better place. I've met new people, made new friends, and started to trust again. I've learned that betrayal doesn't define you, it shapes you. It makes you stronger, more resilient, and more aware of what you truly deserve. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm ready to face it. Julia may have shattered my world, but I'm the one who put the pieces back together. And that's something she'll never be able to take away from me.